think back to like your earliest Easter memories? I was thinking about this week of like what was my first Easter that I really remember, and it's just so vivid for me. I was 6 years old, and I woke up first that Easter morning, and I went out in our living room, and I saw that we had Easter baskets, me and my siblings, and they looked like they had lots of candy and the fake green grass that you put in there, and some other things, and it was just like, wow, that looks pretty cool. And I knew I shouldn't get into it yet. Nobody else was awake, so I go to wake up my parents. And I go into my parents' bedroom. I go over to the side of the bed where my dad usually slept, and I wake him up. I go to wake him up, and my grandma's there. And it scared me to death because I've never met your grandma, but my grandma's scary. Like, my grandma's still alive, and I'm still scared of her. And at 6 years old, I was just like, I don't know why, I was scared of my grandma. And I was just startled that neither my mom or dad were there. It was just my grandma. And I'm like, Grandma, where's my mom and dad? It's Easter. And she goes, well, honey, they went to the hospital. And I'm like, oh no, what's wrong? Why'd they go to the hospital? Remember, I'm 6. And she said, she's having the baby. I was like, oh, I forgot. My mom has been pregnant now for the last 9 months. So my youngest brother, Bobby, he was born on Easter morning. And when you have a sibling born and you're 6, that's like, an Easter you don't ever forget. And it was really cool. My grandma took us later that day down to the hospital and got to hold my baby brother and was fairly convinced I was going to drop and break it. And it was just a great Easter and just super kind of startling the way grandma handled it. But what are some of you ever think about that? Like, what do I remember about my earliest times or Easters or different holidays? And what was Easter like for you as you grew up? Or what is Easter today? What is it for you, for your family? And is it really a special, meaningful time? Is it just another day? Is it just a holiday and lots of food? And the Easter Bunny, the Easter Bunny goes all the way back to the time of Jesus. We have evidence of that. Look at this picture of Jesus. It's apparently his idea. Just to be clear, that's fake. It's not real. It's a joke. So don't email me about this. Stole that from Facebook. Not a big deal. But right, Easter's fun, and we have all these things. But do you ever think about what is it for your roommate, for your coworkers, for the people that live near you, the people that you do life with? For kids, we know that Easter's about eggs and candy and the baskets and all those things. And is it become any different? And I think back like when I was 6 and I was young, and our family, we went to church every weekend, and we were at church for sure on holidays when people weren't born. And I just remember being told Easter is a celebration of Jesus rising from the dead. And maybe you've been told the same thing. You probably have, and you're telling your kids the same thing. And that's what it is. But have you ever stopped to think about, is that really true? Did you ever along your path of growing up, I got to different places in my life where I was like, well, that's what I've been told, but is that really what happened? And sometimes we have to realize that the Easter of our childhood, not just the candy and the eggs, sometimes it needs to grow up a little bit. And I think for sure the people that God puts around us who maybe have questions or skepticism or doubts or not always believing the things of their childhood anymore. I think it's worthy for us to have a conversation to look at this idea of Jesus being intriguing today from the viewpoint of, is Easter real? Is it a true story? Is it just a holiday that we wish was true, or we hope is true, or someone told us it was true when we were a kid, and we just never have thought about it? Because you know this to be the reality of the situation is a lot of people in our community, a lot of people in your life, they've doubted the validity of this story. They don't necessarily believe what we believed or the conclusions we've come to. And maybe there's a way we can understand this aspect of Easter and have a conversation with someone or start to help them see that it really is a true event. Because this question, I think, is still very legitimate for us to dig into. Is Jesus actually alive? Because if the events of Easter are true, then what we're saying, not only did Jesus resurrect, but that he's also active, he's alive, he's engaged in our world, because that's what he said he would do. That's what the followers, the people that we hear about him from, that's what they said, is if he's alive, he's active. He's engaged. He's not just sitting on a cloud in heaven waiting for you and I to join him there. If Easter's true, then the other things he said are true too, that he would be with us. So let's look at this question from the viewpoint of maybe you have those doubts and you've never really questioned it or wrestled with it, and you need to. But I know the people we're going to talk to this week are going to question the validity or the answer to this question. And I want to start with what Jesus says about himself. In the gospel, the biography of his, written by Mark, in the 8th chapter, you find a couple of phrases and things that Jesus says that are really important to this conversation. It says, he began to teach them that the Son of Man, that's a phrase referring to Jesus. The Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, teachers of the law. They must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside, began to rebuke him. Jesus is so clear, he's speaking so plainly. He's going to die, he's going to then resurrect. And Peter is like, no, Jesus, that's wrong. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And he says he rebuked him, and then Jesus turned, looked at the disciples, and rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan. You don't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. What's found a couple chapters later? Second situation. Jesus says this in Mark 10. They're on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way. The disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Because Jesus has been telling them for quite some time now, when we go to Jerusalem, I'm going to die. So you probably would do what I would do in that situation, not go to Jerusalem. Right? That's why it tells us Jesus is very clear. Jesus is leading the way because nobody else is going on this trip unless Jesus goes first. Nobody else is thinking, wow, that sounds like a great plan. Why don't you go die? That makes perfect sense. They were afraid. They were astonished because he's been telling them what's going to happen. Again, he took the 12 aside, told them what was going to happen to him. We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death. They will hand him over to the Gentiles, to the Romans, who will mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. Jesus is getting more specific, and it's not making the news any better. He's saying this is exactly what's going to happen in the sequence of events. And then, 3 days later, I will rise. I'm not sure why Jesus is referring to himself in this passage so much in the third person. Don't let that confuse you. He is predicting where and how and by whose hand and by what order of events will he die, and that he will resurrect. Jesus said what was going to happen. Andy Stanley, a well-known pastor and author, says it this way: if someone predicts their own death and resurrection and then pulls it off, we should listen to that person. I think there's probably no better way to say what we're saying is that Jesus said what was going to happen, and then it happened. There's another part of this story that I think is really important for you and I to understand and to wrestle with. Is it true or is it not? You see, there's the aspect of what happens to Peter, for instance. See, Peter's following Jesus. You read a little bit about him in that first passage. And Peter's one of Jesus' followers, one of his closest friends. He's part of the inner circle of 3. And he's following Jesus wholeheartedly. For 3 years, he left behind his family business. He's seen all the miracles. He's went on the mission trip with Jesus. I mean, he's done it all. He walked on water with Jesus. And the night before Jesus dies, right before he's arrested, in this upper room where they're having a meal together, Jesus says to Peter, Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times tonight. And Peter's like, what are you talking about, man? You're crazy. I've done everything with you. He said, I'll die for you. I'll die with you. And Jesus said, no, you won't. Before rooster crows, before morning, you'll deny me 3 times. Jesus predicts this. So we have Peter, who's following Jesus like closer than anyone, says he'll do anything until it got hard. Jesus is arrested. He's going through a trial, and it's at this high priest's house. It's the middle of the night, and people come up to Peter 3 times. Hey, aren't you from Galilee? You're one of his guys, right? No, I don't know him. Now your accent, it's the same, right? You're one of Jesus' friends. No, I don't know what you're talking about. No, we just saw you with him recently. Weren't you there? Peter, who followed Jesus, unfollows Jesus. You have to understand this sequence of events because it's so important. Peter runs. After his third denial, he hears a rooster crow. It reminds him what Jesus told him just a few hours ago. He's heartbroken, but he's not heartbroken in the sense of, like, I made a mistake. Jesus, try to help me here. He's heartbroken to where, and he's scared, I'm sure, that he takes off. Peter unfollows Jesus through his denials and his reactions next, because you read the rest of the events that are recorded in these biographies, and Peter's nowhere to be found. Some of Jesus' mother and some women, John is around at the crucifixion. Peter's not there because he's not there. He's gone. He unfollowed Jesus. The day that Jesus dies, that afternoon, that evening, two of his followers go to Pilate and say, can we have his body? Can we prepare it for burial and treat it with respect and do the proper things in their culture and the customs? Peter's not one of those followers. He's not there. He's unfollowed Jesus. Sunday morning, when a group of women go to the tomb to finish the hurried burial procedures that hadn't been done properly Friday because of the holiday approaching, Peter's not there. He's hiding in a locked room, having unfollowed Jesus. But then the most amazing thing happens. And you can read the history of this. You can read the account of it in your Bible under the heading, The Acts of the Apostles. It's Peter refollows Jesus. Peter, something has changed his life where the guy who was so close to Jesus, and as soon as it got hard, he leaves Jesus behind, he unfollows Jesus, follows Jesus completely. And the whole rest of his life is a series of events that are difficult and challenging, and his life is always on the line, and he never wavers. In fact, just a few weeks after Jesus' death, Peter is standing in front of the same group of people who condemned Jesus to die, the same group of people that had Jesus on trial in that courtroom, that high priest's house where Peter denied Jesus. That same group of people tell Peter to quit talking about Jesus or that he would face the same fate. And the guy who ran, just a few weeks later, looks at them and says, you judge whether I should obey you or God. Because I've seen Jesus resurrected, and I will keep talking about that. No other explanation is reasonable to the change that you see in Peter's life than what he said it was. His witnessing of a resurrected Jesus. See, friends, that's just one piece of proof. Because the guy who ran and hid at the first sign of trouble never does it again. And he wasn't deluded. He wasn't making something up. See, he met and encountered the resurrected, living, life-giving, purpose-changing, life-altering Jesus. To the point where at the end of his life, Peter is sitting in a Roman jail cell being asked to quit talking about the resurrection of Jesus. And that refusal is crucified on a Roman cross, just as Jesus was. The resurrection changed Peter. Because he followed Jesus, he unfollowed Jesus. And because of the resurrection, he followed him again like never before. Peter is just one. Happened to Jesus' brother James. You have brothers and sisters, many of us. James goes from thinking Jesus is crazy and needs to be institutionalized, delusional, to calling him Lord. My siblings never called me anything that nice, our whole lives, still today. James follows Jesus. He doesn't follow Jesus just because they're brothers. He follows him after the resurrection to become one of the leaders of the early church. Paul goes from, I think this thing of Jesus is crazy, and I'm going to put the people who believe in it and are propagating this lie in jail and being part of some of their executions. He's killing people who are following Jesus. And then he meets Jesus, resurrected. and he changes 180 degrees. He's the one that wrote these words to a church in Corinth just a few years after this event of his change. He says, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures." And when he says the scriptures, he's talking about in the Old Testament, the Hebrew literature, that it talked about the Messiah would die and rise again, and it was very this prophecy, but you have to remember, Jesus said this as well. He predicted this. Paul's saying, we knew this was going to happen, we just didn't realize it. And he said, and then Jesus, after he resurrected, appeared to Peter. That Cephas is Peter's other name, is actually his proper name. Then to the 12, and after that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James. That's Jesus' brother. He saw his brother resurrected. And then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me, to Paul, as to one abnormally born. What Paul tells us, and I love the way in which he writes this. He said, friends, I'm not making this up. I wasn't on like some sort of hallucination or some mind trip on that road to Damascus. I saw Jesus alive. And so did these 500 people. This isn't some small group of folks trying to make up a new illegal religion so they can die. These weren't a few crazy people. It wasn't even just the 12. It wasn't just Peter. It's all these different groups of people. And he said, if you don't believe me, go find them. They're alive still today. Jesus' resurrection is true. It's true. And I want to show you one more thing that maybe help you and maybe even just help a conversation or two along the way. See, I hear things and you hear things sometimes when you bring up these topics is there are different theories and ideas that go around and they say things like, well, later Jesus' followers, like 200 or 300 years later, they went back and rewrote these stories to make it look good, to make a resurrection, to make Jesus look like he was something he wasn't, but that was later. Like Christians did that, and they wrote these stories, and that really has to come from the mindset that for 300 years, a group of people decided to buy into a cult, the beginners of which knew it wasn't real, and all died for that lie. And then over time, more and more people believed this lie, and they decided to make up stories to make the lie sound more believable. And that just doesn't happen, friends. Not in groups of people like what we have here. And also what we have here is I want to show you where we get some of this information. I want to show you a list of names on the screen, and some of these you'll recognize, some of them you won't. See, Mark is the one who wrote everything we've been reading today about Jesus. He wrote a gospel, an account of Jesus' life. And what we know, and I'll actually read this to you in a second, is that Mark got all of his information from Peter. What I find interesting about that is a lot of the information in Mark's gospel about Peter makes Peter look like kind of a knucklehead. And I don't know why later, if you're trying to create superheroes of your like mystical made-up religion, that you would make the founder, like that's not the founder of Jesus, but like the next guy, the first pope. Why would you make him a knucklehead if you're telling a story to create some new lie? That's not how stories are made. But anyway, Peter is Mark's source, and then John, you've probably heard of John. He was also one of Jesus' followers. There's this interesting chain of documents, ancient documents, that talk about Mark and his gospel. Because what happens is at the end of John's life, and we know this historically, John lived to a very old age. He lived into the 90s AD, many years after the events of Jesus' life, that he had a conversation with a guy named Papias, that with, however you say that name with all the P's. And Papias wrote about his conversation with John. See, Papias in the year 140 AD wrote about a conversation he'd had when he was a young man, when John was an old man. And then when Papias is an old man, he writes about his conversation with John just one generation after the events. And Eusebius, the name at the very far right, he was a church historian who read Papias' work and quotes it, takes a chunk of it and puts it in his writings just a few years after that. And his writings, the writings of Eusebius, we actually still have copies of today. And he quotes Papias, who had a conversation with John, the elder, the follower of Jesus. And this is what Eusebius wrote of Papias' work. He said, the elder said this, that John said this. So it's a quote, one generation from the event. Mark, who became Peter's interpreter, wrote accurately, though not in order, all that he remembered of the things said or done by the Lord. For Mark, had neither heard the Lord nor been one of his followers, but afterwards, as I, John, have said, he had followed Peter, who used to compose his discourses with a view to the needs of his hearers, but not as though he were drawing up a connected account of the Lord's sayings. So Mark made no mistake in thus recording some things just as he remembered them. For he was careful in this one thing, to omit none of the things he'd heard, and to make no untrue statements therein. Eusebius quotes Papias, who had a conversation with John. And in that conversation, that's what he remembered John saying, is that what you and I read in our Gospel of Mark is what John remembered happening. It's what Peter told Mark had happened. And so two eyewitnesses corroborate the same story that we have and we know is the same that we have today. And even if there's other parts of Scripture, there's other parts of the Bible that you go, well, what about this and what about that? If you just look at the Gospel of Mark, and we know that it's true and it's accurate, it's enough to know and to follow Jesus, to completely trust your entire life, to stand on what we sang earlier, cornerstone, to stand your life on Jesus. If only Mark. And we have so much more available. And there's theory after theory after theory that Christians later, that popes later, that people created a lie and propagated it and changed it. And that what we are putting our faith in is nothing but a great story that we wish were true. And those theories just don't hold up to the evidence. The evidence of Peter's life. How does somebody unfollow somebody and then refollow them willing to die when previously they were willing to run and hide? The evidence of things like what we just read, and there's so many other pieces of this. See, friends, the story of Easter, the events of resurrection are 100% true. Which means Jesus is alive. He's alive today. He's active, he's engaged in this world, this place that we call home, this place that we live. It's a true event. It's trustworthy. And I find it completely intriguing. And I want you to think about things like this. What difference has this made in your life? What difference has the resurrection? What difference has your encounter with the living, life-changing, breathing, active Jesus made in your life? Because friends, when we can start to understand that, when we can start to articulate the answer to this question or questions like it, then we have the opportunity to share that with people around us. Because there is a difference he's made. And I wonder, how could you and I talk? How could we talk about that difference this week? I mean, it's Easter. To talk about the event of the resurrection, it's not weird right now. In October, it might be a little weird to bring up, but it's Easter. I mean, everyone knows that what's coming, and most of our friends are participating in some way this holiday, even if it's just to have a nice honey-baked ham or to go to brunch. We get Easter. What a natural time to start a conversation, to ask a question, and to your friends, to your family, your coworker, your roommate. And I would suggest just let me give you one. If you don't think of a way that's naturally coming to your mind, what if you just this week asked your friends, and what I'm going to try to do with the people around me that God's put in my life, is just ask the question, do you think the events of Easter are true? Do you think the story of Easter, is it real? What if you just ask that question? And not like in some accusatory way, like, hey, let's start a debate. Or I know you don't think it's real. you're a skeptic, or you're this or that. No, not to label people, not to argue with them. What if you just had an honest conversation? And it started with just a question, asking them what they think. And then listen and wait politely for them to ask you what you think. What kind of conversation could God bring out of that? What kind of thing could he do with just a simple question? Do you think the events of Easter are true? And you could share the difference that the resurrected Jesus has made in your life. That Easter is the perfect time to bring this up, my friends. We all know someone. We all know someone who needs the living, active, engaged, life-changing, purpose-giving, resurrected Jesus. You know somebody who needs that, don't you? Are you willing to have a conversation with him this week? Who is it that God's been telling you, as we've been talking about how intriguing Jesus is for several weeks, and he's put on our mind many, many people. Who are you willing to talk to this week about Jesus? Maybe it could just be as simple as you go back to what we talked about earlier and you just text the word Easter and you get a card and you go, I could send that. I'd be willing to send somebody an invite to just start a conversation or just maybe to help them come and experience just a few minutes next weekend. The hope that a living Jesus offers us. He's not just living and waiting for us, he's living and he's active and he's engaged in our life. And we all know somebody, we all are people who need that hope. That's what Jesus offers you and I. And he offers to every person we're going to see this week. Hope. Because he's alive. The facts of Easter are true. We're going to sing this song that's called just that, Living Hope. Because it's what we need. And it's what we have the opportunity to have and to share with those around us. So would you stand and join the team as they lead us in this song?